Hi class, welcome to this week. Sorry I'm getting my video up a little late. My brother came for a surprise visit this weekend, which was very nice, but also a surprise, and so I didn't get as much done as I would have liked. He's in the Air Force, and hadn't seen him actually in quite a while, and you don't always know when they can come visit because of he's been overseas. Anyway, so it was very nice to see him, but it did kind of prevent me from getting stuff done as quickly as I would like. Anyway, though, I'm very glad to get started with you all this week on the actual text of the Canterbury Tales. And we're covering the general prologue this week, obviously. And it's one of the most read pieces of literature really out there. One of the most cited as far as just being really interesting. And when we talk about estate satire, we talk more about the general prologue than we do about some of the tales that are actually within the Canterbury Tales. Those kind of are individual genres that fit into the characterizations that the general prologue establishes, but they themselves are not necessarily estate satire. The general prologue is the primary estate satire, and the tales are kind of just included with the wider umbrella that the general prologue describes. Anyway, so we have quite a few characters that the general prologue describes. 20 and 9 in a company. I believe it's describing it roughly that way. And so you've got an interesting set. And Chaucer does a really good job of presenting the real variety of characters that existed in the Middle Ages. From, obviously he represents your aristocrats in the knight and the squire, and he starts with them, and that's important that he starts with them because they are at the top of the food chain, so to speak. So he starts with them as kind of a courtesy and kind of a, CYA, protect yourself kind of thing as well, that he doesn't want to get in trouble for not starting with the right people. And then also he goes on from there and he talks a lot about clerics or clergy, people in the church. And then he also talks about peasants and freemen. He talks about a yeoman who's a woodsman, freeman. And then he talks about tradesmen that are in kind of that bourgeoisie class that we have discussed that wasn't necessarily an official class at the time, but one we certainly recognize that was emerging at the time. And he does talk about a number of tradesmen, like the cook, for instance. And then, you also have two other characters that are not in that 29, and they are the host that actually begins the whole idea of the general prologue, which is to have a tell-telling story, a contest telling stories. And then you have the narrator, who's kind of a backdrop character, but we can't really say he's not, in fact, part of that company, though, because he does end up telling some tales. Best I remember, we're not actually going to read any of them, which is kind of funny. You'd think it's the narrator, we should read his stories. Well, to an extent, the narrator represents Chaucer, the author, and to an extent, he doesn't. But representing Chaucer, the author, is really kind of funny because the two tales that he tells are really kind of boring. Not that interesting. There's not as much to say about them as some of the other characters' tales, and so we're kind of covering the ones that there's a little more to say about. You are certainly welcome to go look them up. The Tale of Mellowby is, having read it a number of times, is really kind of a snooze fest. Not a bad tale. It has some good messages, but it's not, like I said, it's not as interesting. And then the other one's The Tale of Sir Topas, and it's very sing-songy, and a little bit annoying, and unfinished as well. So, again, those are the two tales of the narrator that we're not reading, and those are the reasons why. But we also have these other interesting things about the narrator that come out. He kind of presents himself as a little bit of a bumbler, not really a capable sort of person to tell this sort of information. He also presents himself as a reporter, that his goal and his job is not really to interpret the characters' behaviors or what they say or who they are as much as it is just to report to you what he sees and notices. That's a really important thing to notice about Chaucer's narrator, because we're going to see it again in Troilus and Cressida later in the semester, that he tends to have narrators that have similar characteristics in that view. He tries to have them kind of come across as naive a little, and just to come across as a reporting fashion. In some ways, I think this is so he tries to establish his narrator as a reliable narrator, that you can trust the person who's telling you this information because they're not just dropping opinions or uncredible information, left and right. He wants you to believe the narrator and believe that the information that the narrator is giving you is accurate information, so that you believe that the characters are actually the way he describes them. And for the most part, I think we can, for the most part, believe that the narrator is reliable. But one of the things we do have to know about the narrator and Chaucer and about these characters is that the narrator has a particular opinion about each of these characters, whether or not he's trying to report or not. And the way you can see that is not always that he specifically says, I like them or I don't. It's his word choice and the way he describes them. In fact, there are some characters that are not all that nice. They're not good characters. They don't live well, and they don't live according to the way they probably should be living, at least according to the dictates of the time, moral ideas, that kind of thing. They don't live well in that way, but they're likable. They're personable. And so the narrator still likes them, even though they're not exactly good people. He still likes them. And so that's something you have to understand about each of the portraits, is as you read carefully, read for detail, and especially read for word choice, because it is the tone of each of the descriptions that will tell you what the narrator thinks about the character. A particular example that comes to mind, for the most part, the narrator does not positively describe figures from the church. This actually occurred a lot at the time, and this occurred a lot in Estates satire. That one of the huge functions of estate satire was actually to make fun of people in the church who weren't doing their job correctly and well, and they weren't living up to those moral virtues that they said everyone else should live up to. But since they were in the church, they were really expected to live up to those virtues. And when they didn't, people outside the church would notice and, of course, point to them as hypocrites. And so there's a lot of satire on people from the church who did not live righteously. And this is no different. The General Prologue has many portraits of people in the church, both lay people who are people associated with the church but are not officially kind of in its structure. They're not priests or monks. But like the pardoner and the summoner, they are lay people who also have kind of a function with the church. And then you have those like the friar and the parson that are actually within the church, and the monk. Of all of these, the narrator criticizes the monk because he hunts. He likes to go do horse breeding and has his dogs, and hunting is a real pastime for him. Did this actually occur at the time? Yes. Monks, in fact, did go hunting. In fact, monasteries were quite well off. Quite a bit of money was given to them by the wealthy so they could pray for their sins and that sort of stuff. And extra sons and daughters, so to speak, since only one primarily inherited an estate, though you might inherit smaller pieces if you were a daughter or a second or a third son. Extra sons and daughters, that fourth, fifth, sixth son, where do they go? Well, often they were actually given to the church. And just given, not at their choosing, and it would be when they were very young. And they were given to the church because then the family, the aristocratic family who would place them in the church would then have influence with their local parish. And that influence could mean something as abstract as prayer, though at the time prayer itself was very important because of their belief in souls and purgatory, and how important it was for you to pray for each other in order for a soul to ascend out of purgatory and into paradise. And so that was actually a really important thing. But also it just comes down to nuts and bolts money. The church controlled a lot of money, and if you had someone from your family that you kept close ties with that was in the church, you could manipulate those familial ties, and that person in the church would direct more resources your way or speak for you in political situations, because the church had a lot more influence over political situations at the time. And so that was important. So families would try and get influence with the church by putting sons and daughters in local monasteries, and often the sons and daughters of wealthy families became the leaders of abbeys, monasteries, convents, all that sort of thing. They became the leaders generally. It wasn't generally the poor, good, righteous person. It was the wealthy person. The wealthy people, just wherever they were at, tended to rise to power. And wealth will do that. And so you have that idea of these people who are not righteous in the church, and there's a number of reasons why, what I just described to you, and also the Black Death, 13, I think it's 43, or maybe it's 48, one of those years, I have to remind myself, the Black Death occurs, and over the course of the whole 1340s, remember the Canterbury Tales is coming out in the late 1380s, a third of the population of Europe dies. It may be a quarter, it could even be more than a third, but we know millions die. I mean, it's just absolutely tears up all of Europe. I mean, that's hard to think that if you were sitting in a class with your classmates and there were 30 people in them there and you came in the next day and 10 of them were dead. I mean, it would be like that just a third of the population's entirely wiped out. And what happened was that the people who often cared for the sick were in the church. And the good people caring for the sick were also the ones that got sick. And so they died. And so the ones that were left were maybe not so good. Because the ones that were really caring for the sick were, gone. And so you have a number of reasons for why there's corruption in the church, besides just good old human nature. And Chaucer gets after that. And he talks about the monk in that way, that you've got this issue of wealth with the monk and having, nice horses and hunting, which is really an aristocratic pastime, not something that a church person should be doing. The idea of a monk is that a monk has closed themselves off from the world and worldly things and really just praises God and prays for the souls of the other people in the world and that they're righteous. They live lives of sacrifice and voluntary poverty and that sort of thing, and they are very moderate in their lifestyles, and that is not this monk. But the narrator likes the monk. He describes him relatively positively, even while criticizing these features. Another character, though, he doesn't like so well, is the friar. But the friar is described somewhat more positively than another one of these church characters, or two of these church characters actually, and that's the summoner and the pardoner, especially the summoner, who is described with pimples on his face, as being very unattractive, waxy yellow hair, and he talks about him going after women and all that sort of thing. And so some of these characters are described really negatively. The whole makeup of the character, physical appearance, and characteristics is described very negatively. And the friar, despite being a very bad person, in fact, it's a friar that carries the knives and the needles in his pockets to give to young wives he's gotten pregnant so that they can cause their own abortions, which is, not something that's very, should be approved of. These are some of the things that are going on, but the friar is personable, and the personability of the character often affects the narrator's attitude and description. He may kind of rag on them a little bit about their shortcomings, but he may still describe them at least somewhat positively, even using irony. The narrator just takes a huge tone of irony with most of these characters and their shortcomings, but there still may be a positive side to it just based on their personability, because the friar is jolly, and the summoner and the pardoner are not so jolly. They're more lecherous, and he describes them as such. And the other thing is, then you have the one good character that's in the church, and he's described with all of those qualities that a church person should have, and that's the parson. And there's nothing the parson does that's wrong. I mean, he does exactly what he's supposed to do. On foot, he goes to see all his parishioners, he manages them, he stays local, he doesn't go wandering off, he's certainly not off hunting, he's not spending a lot of money. The prioress is also a figure in the church, and the big thing about the prioress is she's one of those children that was given to the church, and she's from a wealthy family. And so she wants to live like a wealthy lady. She doesn't want to live the life of a nun. She's not a particularly bad person. Chaucer doesn't criticize her. She's actually attractive. But she wants to live like a lady at court, not like a nun. And that's somewhat to be criticized. But she, other than that, her character is fairly positively portrayed. She's personable. And, she's practiced courtly arts and all that kind of thing. Anyway, so that's kind of what he's talking about when he's talking about church people. And so, there's positive and there's negative characters. And he covers quite a few people in the church. And, kind of looking back at the knight and the squire, they're both described relatively positively. The knight and the parson are probably the only two characters that come immediately to mind that are described entirely positively. In fact, there's no negative comments about them at all. There's really no irony at all in their descriptions, like the friar. The friar has a lot of irony in his particular portrait. And so, that's kind of the way this narrator plays. He skips back and forth. The squire has a little bit, because the squire is a little bit of a lusty young man. I mean, he's no different than college-age guys, a lot of them, not all of them, but, 19, 20, 21, that's really when you start dating a lot, and that's sort of what you have here with the squire, a young man who's going out and watching his appearance and trying to attract young ladies' attention, and so the narrator's just kind of poking fun at that, though in a good way, not like he's a horrible person or anything, just that he's saying, that's youth and that's what they do. So we've been talking about the characters, people in the church. We kind of talked a little bit about the narrator. He likes to be naive, but he definitely has opinions about each of the characters. Talked a little bit about like the squire and the knight. Talked a little bit about the prioress, some of the other church figures. The plowman, like the parson, they're brothers actually. They're both kind of your good, ideal figures. So you have the knight, who's the ideal figure for the aristocratic class. You have the parson, who's the ideal figure for the clergy. And then you have the plowman, who's the ideal figure for the commoner's estate. So those are the three estates and the three figures that kind of represent the ideal for each of them. And so then you have characters who represent like the exact opposite of what you want to be. Of those characters, you have, you can include the summoner, the pardoner, or the friar. Really, the friar is kind of the utmost example of a bad clergyman. You have an example of someone who's bad at bad for kind of a commoner's class, and the miller, who's also not that positively described. And then you also have a slightly negative view of the squire. Anyway, so, criticism of the things that they are. And then we also have the bourgeoisie classes that are represented, or the bourgeoisie characters that are represented. And of these, a number of them kind of have negative portraits. The cook is not portrayed very positively. Neither is the merchant, though he seems positive. The franklin as well. And these aren't displayed entirely negatively because, again, they're kind of personable. But they, what am I thinking? But they still don't live the best lives. They have their shortcomings. And, to get into the specific poetry of it, if you look at, sorry, I'm flipping in my book to find the section I was looking for. Okay, let's see. And we'll look at each of the specific characters' portraits for the tales that we're going to read in much greater detail when we get to those tales. I'm just kind of giving you a general overview right now of the Canterbury Tales. Okay, for instance, here's the merchant. A merchant was there with a forked beard, and mottily and he on horse he sat. Upon his head a Flandrish beaver hat, his boat is clasped fair and fetisly. His raisins he spake full solemnly, swooning away the increase of his whinning. He wold the say were kept for anything betwixt Middleburgh and Orwell. Well could he in a strange shieldless sail, this worthy man full well his wit beset, there wist no wight that he was in debt. So a stately was he of his governance, with his bargainets and with his chevisance, for sooth he was a worthy man withal, but sooth the same, he knew how men him call. So he doesn't know his name, but he's also saying, the merchant isn't the best merchant, because he's in debt. And he wants, he's all about bargains, and he can live in a style that seems to say he's not in debt. But, let's see, where else was I looking? No. And then you have, let's see, because we're not going to read his, okay, there's a person. Sorry, I'm making sure I find, okay, then we have a character here. Here's a character we have that is not so positively portrayed, and that's the character of the Reeve. And the Reeve actually tells a tale right after the Miller's Tale. Both the Miller's Tale and the Reeve's Tale are actually quite dirty. I'll just kind of forewarn you about that. And, that they had dirty tales, dirty jokes in the Middle Ages. We may have this kind of false image of the Middle Ages not having sex happening, but that, obviously we wouldn't be here if it didn't happen at the time. And they told dirty tales about it, and they liked them. And in fact, half the time it was someone in the church that wrote the dirty tale down, and they were called Fablio, and we'll talk about it a little more when we get to the Miller's Tale. But it's interesting to look at these things because they tell you something about humor at the time. What was considered humorous, what was still considered vulgar, because the things that were considered vulgar now are also considered vulgar at the time, but that doesn't mean it's not still information about the time in its own way. And like I said, we'll talk about that in greater detail, but the Reeve does tell a dirty tale, and you kind of see why. It says, let's say, looking at the modern English, just to say, he was a slender, choleric man. His beard was shaved as close as could be. His hair was shorn around his ears. The top of his head was clipped like a priest in front. His legs were very long and lean, like a staff. No calf was visible. So he's thin. He's a little overly thin, actually. So, again, we kind of have a negative physical image giving evidence of not such a great inside as well. He knew very well how to watch over a granary and a bin. No auditor could catch him short. He would calculate, according to droughts and rains, what the yield of his seed and grain should be. His lord's sheep, his cattle, his dairy, his pigs, his horses, his stores, and his poultry were wholly in this Reeve's power. So what we have is basically someone who's a steward, is a young man, and this man cares for his property. And the Reeve has complete and total control of this young man's property. But the young men trust him. And he's a fairly shrewd man, the Reeve is. No man could find him to be in arrears. There was no bailiff, shepherd, or other laborer whose tricks and plots were unknown to him. They were scared to death of him, so people can't get one by him. I mean, he's pretty shrewd. He catches things fairly quickly, and he has a pleasant house. In fact, a very nice house. It talks about, he was a better buyer than his lord, and had privately laid by considerable riches. And then this is how he does it. He knew how to please his lord well, underhandedly giving and lending him the lord's own goods. So he takes from what the lord owns and gives it back to the lord as a gift, so it looks like it comes from his property instead of the lord's own. And so he's stealing from the lord. And so what you find out is the reason why he knows all the tricks of the people that can't get one by him is because he pulls them on everybody else. And so he's a thief, And then it notes that he's a carpenter as well. He has a good farm horse, a dappled gray called Scott. He wears a long blue outer coat. So, and he's one of the things it notes, and the narrator makes notes like this fairly frequently. It says he rode last in our company. That means he's not personable. So the narrator is harsher on him. He's not likable. And when the narrator describes him before his tale in the head notes and the end notes that are poetry before and after that are kind of continuations of the stories around the tales, then he's also described very negatively. And he's a fairly negative person, and you find out in his own words when he shares them before he tells his tale that he's just negative. And he's an old man, and he's a dirty old man. He's one of those looking for a little blue pill, and because he's looking for it, because he just isn't capable of doing that sort of thing anymore, he actually tells tales about it. It's kind of like one of those things you want what you can't have anymore. And so he's kind of almost obsessed with it. And we can talk about that a little more later when we talk about the Miller, because the Miller and the Reeve kind of get into a little battle between the two of them in their tales. And that's part of the reason why. And both of them tell tales about lust, because they're both interested in it, but for different reasons. The Miller, because he's young enough to do something about it, and the older man, because he's not capable of doing anything about it anymore. I do think it's important to point these sorts of things out, and you're like, oh, God, she's saying a whole lot about sex. Well, quite frankly, Chaucer himself says a whole lot about it. They were really kind of obsessed with it in the Middle Ages. Not in the sense that there wasn't any around, but in the sense of, I mean, just think today. If you walk into a Protestant church, you're likely to see a pastor who's married. But if you walk into a Catholic church, you will see a priest who's not. Chastity was a huge, huge thing at the time. And in a way, chastity was actually one of women's few ways of having power. Because if you signed up to be a nun, you would get learning, and you had control over your body, which is not something you had if you were married off necessarily. Often your father would marry you off. Or a lord, even. And so you were more like property. And so chastity in its way, as much as we may think of it as not always being, to some degree, it really is a good thing for many things, for many reasons. I remember my mother always talking to me about being reasonable about those sorts of relationships, because, not just because of diseases and things, but you get so emotionally attached to a person you get involved with in a physical relationship. That's very difficult if that relationship ends, and it's much more difficult if you're, if that's not good. And so they were obsessed with it at the time too, not so much in relationships like that, or even necessarily in the sense of, sexually transmitted diseases that we're more worried about today, but more in the sense of it actually being a source of power, that people in the church, and women especially, were actually able to live lives they chose a little more by choosing lives of chastity. But they were expected to live lives of chastity, and of course they're criticized when they don't. Like we said, the friar is not chaste, and neither is the summoner, and they are criticized fairly heavily for that, because they're supposed to live chaste lives, because they work with the church. And so, Chaucer points to a lot of the issues with this, because it's seen as a particular sin at the time. And, a particularly strong sin, that here you've kind of been given a social right and a social power that you wouldn't normally have, but you're expected to sacrifice for it. And so when you are expected to sacrifice and you don't end up sacrificing for that, we're going to call you out on it. You're a hypocrite. And so they would get called out on it. And Chaucer's not the only one that does it. And so it was a particular interest at the time. And so I point that out for that reason. Not because I only ever think about sex, but because it was an issue at the time. And it was actually an issue of power. That you had, one of the few ways to have power over your own body was to join the church. And of course, they laughed about things, just like we laugh about things that go on physically, and not just with sex, but other things that happen, bad smells and that sort of thing. They joked about those too. And, because as humans, we laugh at the unexpected, and they did it at the time too. There were a lot of things they had in common with us in terms of senses of humor. People falling down was funny, just like it is funny today. The Three Stooges, people falling down, getting knocked over, we find that funny. As long as we don't believe people are really, really hurt bad, we tend to find it funny. And it's the same at the time. You see people falling over and it's funny, and you're expected to laugh. And, but so then you have just the whole setup of the tell-telling. Of course, they're just trying to win a dinner, which isn't all that much of a prize. They're headed off to Canterbury. It's 2 days there, it's 2 days back. 4 days to tell tales. 29 people to tell tales, 2 apiece. You do the math, that's a lot of tales. Well, he doesn't finish it, right? There's not actually that many tales. I think there's 24 total. And so, obviously he didn't finish it. He was working on it, but he didn't finish it. Nonetheless, what we do have is still just really masterful. It's such a good picture of so much of what's going on in the Middle Ages, in terms of the characters of the Middle Ages, the people, and in terms of the kinds of stories they liked to tell in the Middle Ages. And of course, that will come up more and more as we actually get into the stories themselves. So we have here the general prologue. It's a really interesting piece of literature for a number of different reasons. Full of irony, full of humor, certainly tongue-in-cheek. Like we said, the narrator, he likes some people, he doesn't like other people. And it sets up a really kind of just interesting situation. And you can imagine, I mean, even today, people will sit around a campfire and try and one-up somebody else with a better story. Sometimes it's a ghost story. Sometimes it's a funny story about their family, or it's a travel story. People will sit around and they share stories all the time. Often it seems like we go do things, so we have a story to tell. One of my favorite TV shows is Pawn Stars. And one of the things they talk about as a selling point or bringing people in the door is it a conversation piece? And we look for things that inspire conversation and that inspire stories. And so the Canterbury Tales and the General Prologue has just kind of encapsulated in this neat little 800-line or so poem that very thing, our drive to share, to communicate, to be social, and to have conversation, and to share things we're interested in. And for many of the characters in the Canterbury Tales, this is one of the few opportunities they have to really have a voice and speak what their interest for their class, their social situation, and their individual situations are. And they express those by telling their stories. We'll especially see that when we get to The Wife of Bath. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. I know it's been a bit long, but I really love the Canterbury Tales, and I really love the General Prologue because of it's like a coat of many colors, the characters that are in it. And there's a lot of literature that's not anywhere near as rich as this with the many different characters. And it's very well written, especially considering that it's still rhymed, And it's much harder to rhyme in English than in languages like Spanish or French, where many of the words end in have the same sorts of endings. And English doesn't have that as much, so it's harder to rhyme in English. And so I just really enjoy it, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And I hope you found a character that you liked or didn't. I'm a particular fan of the narrator myself. He's interesting. He kind of hides behind this certain persona. And, he pretends to be naive, and the person writing it, Chaucer, is not so naive. He's well-traveled, he's well-educated. And so I just kind of like that aspect. He's unexpected. I don't know that I'd say he's my favorite. I really, really enjoy The Wife of Bath. Of course, I enjoy The Wife of Bath because I've also read her tale, and some of you may have as well. But, there's a number of different characters to like. There's some I really am not a huge fan of, whether or not the narrator likes them. I don't like the friar, for instance. But, I hope you enjoy it. Find a character that you like and you identify with. Maybe it'll be one of those that we're reading their tales, and you'll learn a little more about them. So, signing off, and we'll see you next week.